our discussion of 2-52, policy 2-52. We'll start with Ms. Fine. Any other comments on 2-52 other than?
Well, I don't feel there's been a satisfactory answer to why this was changed, other than to make the police officers feel more comfortable. I'm not sure if that really is a majority of actual police officers or if that's just a union. And we've run into problems with this before. The union contract that the city has with the contract the city has with the union has restricted us in terms of the number of days we get to view things and stuff. So it matters what that union relationship is, and if there's a legitimate reason for officers other than to be it's more familiar. I still don't know what that is. It sounds more confusing to me reading it. Maybe it's not to them, but I don't see it. And that's what worries me about adding it in. And in terms of the cooperation, I don't think we've been anything but cooperative for quite a long time. And I would say that this meeting was called because our next meeting was September the 12th or 13th, whatever day that was, and that was too close to 21st. So it was really important that we try to get the public to have a voice in this now, while the conversation can still be healthy and productive. And so that's all I have to say. I still don't have an answer to why it's in here, other than it made the police officers feel more comfortable. And change is hard for everybody. You know, I don't see how it makes it clearer. To me, it makes it muddier. I don't think it's as healthy as the one we passed originally.
I think that I'm in agreement. The reemergence of the Graham language after the discussion, I think, is a problem, just generally speaking. And I think that doing so and not allowing the public to have an opportunity to see what was being planned to go forward to the monitor was a misstep, and one that I do feel as though, although I think that there was a little bit of pushback at our last board meeting, I'll say it again, I think we are the voice and the advocate for the community for this very reason. I think that you all had a right to know what was going on, and so here we are.
Chair Waits,
Please.
in response to Board Member Fine, in listening to what Commander Middleton just told us about why Graham found its way back into 252 and the rest of the suite for that matter, it was because the officers wanted it. That was his direct quote verbatim. The problem that I have is that the community does not want it. The monitor also does not want it. I would like to review what happened here. I guess it's going to be the third brief review of what happened. So the way 352, the policy on policies, is written is that a policy should go to the PPRB. When it comes out of the PPRB, it is supposed to then come to the POB. After the POB, it's been presented to the POB, it will thereafter move to the monitor and then to the chief. The reason why we're having this really significant issue is because this policy on policy that we so painstakingly developed over several months was not followed here. So what ended up happening was the policy came to us. The public made comment on the policy as it existed at that time. Then it went to the PPRB, and on 7/10, we see a draft that comes out of the PPRB that is materially changed to incorporate the Graham standard. In response to Mr. Schmiel, I was not made aware of this draft. I personally, speaking for myself, but being a member of the board, was not aware of those language changes until our last full board meeting. So this meeting here is, in essence, a response to that, because what we're supposed to have when we get to when a policy gets to the POB is a near final draft. That way, and public comment is supposed to occur at that time. And so the opposite is what happened here with our most, easily arguably, our most important set of policies, our use of force policies. And the issue that I had with that is that I think it rendered stakeholder, amici, community input strategies for addressing the substance of the use of force policies really ineffective, because the forum was held before the policy was completed. And so I think that, in this instance, we sort of fudged the policy, or we fudged the process, and we got a really horrible result. And I think public input was cut off at the knees because the policy came out of the PPRB after our POB meeting with material changes related to Graham. And I think that this meeting is an excellent demonstration that had all of those Graham paragraphs been in the policy that we saw, that many amici, stakeholders, members of the public would have had something to say about that language. However, there was really no good opportunity to do so. So we've had 6 parties here, and even survivors of a lethal use of force incident to come and speak against these language changes. So I think that really demonstrates that these language changes they're no small thing. And I think arguments saying that, we have the lesser standard is still in there even though Graham has now been incorporated really fall flat. I also think, we shouldn't have deviated from what 352 says we should do to work a policy through. Because I think that, what may have happened here is that we saw, at our full board meeting where we saw 252 come to us, the APOA was here. And the APOA had some time in the hours before our meeting submitted comments in writing to us that said that they wanted Graham to be in this policy. However, at that board meeting, even though they had representatives present, in fact, Mr. Sean Willoughby was here at that meeting, he did not venture up to the podium to say, by the way, we're advocating for Graham to be in this policy. So really, I believe that that was a very underhanded strategy. And it was very effective because then they got to go to the PPRB and say, hey, please put Graham in, and then look at what we end up with. So on Graham, particularly to speak to the Graham standard, it is a lesser standard for the use of force than we are required to contemplate in this policy. The Graham standard imports what are, essentially subjective considerations regarding an officer's perceptions at the time of a use of force incident. That is not, that can arguably run counter to a definition of objectivity. It's kind of, the way that opinion is written is very tricky. I believe having Graham in the policy is misguided. It moves in the opposite direction of the mandates of the CASA, as well as our life-saving and integrity-preserving reform efforts. The Graham standard contains 20/20 hindsight language. And, in effect, it's been used, we've seen it case after case after case, where the result is, in 20/20 hindsight, lethal force was not necessary because a person was not posing an actual threat. But when we have this in our policy, it moves us away from requiring the type of circumspection that one must engage in to make an accurate analysis of whether or not we have an actual threat present and whether use of force is necessary. And we have several people have made comments here today that I really agree with. Primarily that GRAM is for the courtroom. It's an analysis provided by the court ultimately to determine whether or not liability attaches. It analyzes whether a use of force passes a threshold of reasonableness, but it does not seek to understand what the minimal amount of force required in any developing situation may be. That's what this policy is supposed to do. And so GRAM is really a ceiling for force, and this policy is supposed to be about the minimum, which is how do we get as far away from that ceiling possible. Those are two different things. Eking past constitutional muster and what is minimally required, two different things. And so GRAM is not to be used prospectively. It's not for policy. The language and rationale of GRAM contradicts the lesser standard we seek to use for this policy. And again, I would agree with the set of comments that said these additions are very confusing and they're going to be hard to train to, because what you have is you have first a minimum standard and then you have GRAM language right after. And these are different standards. How are you going to really train to a policy that has two different standards? I think that that's confusing and it's illogical and it's inconsistent with the objectives of the community and the consent decree. And so I personally am again asking that APD abandon these GRAM paragraphs in every policy in the use of force suite. Also really wanted to thank everyone for being here. Like I was saying, I think this meeting demonstrates that, had the policy on policy been followed for this particular policy, we would have seen a lot of community input on the GRAM language. I think there is no better testimony to the truth of that statement than having this many people here after 5 p.m. on a Friday to do just that.
Dr. Kass and Mr. Harness, Director Harness, were both mentioned in the remarks as participating in PPRB and voting. It was implied that they voted in favor of Connor. I'd like to know if that's true, and if it's true, what were your thoughts?
Did you turn your mic off?
I did not.
Yes, I did vote, and I think this is in favor of, and I think that my reasons for doing so were to move this process along with the idea that that it was going to be reviewed periodically. I think that I should have been more aware of the significance of the return of the GRAM language, and for that I would, if I were to do it over again, I would put more resistance up. But I think that the important thing here is that it be moved to a point in the process where it can get a public airing. And I think that's what we've succeeded in doing here. And I think I don't want to just, create controversy out of nothing. On the other hand, I think there was an inherent controversy in this, but I think it needed to be publicly aired. And it certainly has engaged the community, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think we've seen the last of it, but I think it does define the lines of the fight, essentially. And it is a fight between wanting to keep, it's essentially the union's position that they want to keep that language in there for their reasons. Primarily that it's been there a long time and it ought to stay there. It's the standard. I believe it's the monitor's position and it's the DOJ's position that this language should be removed. And so I think we now know, and from what I can tell of the community weighs in on the side of removing this language and dealing with the underlying reasons why the DOJ came here. So I'm happy that this conversation has gotten to this point. And I'll leave it at that.
Chair Waits, Board Member Fine. I did vote to pass the policy, and because I think that the officers will be able to differentiate. They will be trained on the minimum use of force. That will be the standard. I believed that the paragraph states that officers are going to be held to Graham, and Graham is there, and it is in an officer's mind, and it is. But the paragraph also states that they're going to be held higher to the stricter policy and the stricter standard. So I was comfortable with the language. I understand how some see that it could be confusing, but I believe that the officers are going to be trained to the matrix of the minimum use of force, and simply stating that intermingling Graham and having it stated as a threshold while realizing that the department is going to hold them to a higher threshold, I was comfortable with it.
Thank you, both. Appreciate it.